Welcome, everybody, to the Cultural Panel number 2. My name is Juan Evaristo. I'm professor of philosophical anthropology at Complutense University of Madrid, and I will moderate the panel. And Josefa, I'm very thankful that you invite me to be with all of you and to learn from all your research. So let's do it. Let me please remind you that any talk has 20 minutes, and after that, we'll have 10 minutes for each speaker to receive any comments, questions, and doubts from the audience. Okay? And since I'll be moderating, let me be the bad guy from the police. I will chronometer your talks, and when you have only 5 minutes left, I will let you know with my hands or something like that. Okay? So we could flow in the panel. Okay, so I'm very glad to introduce our first speaker, that is Annie Runkel. Annie is PhD student at University of Dundee, UK, and is the director of the International Society of Boredom Studies podcast series, which name is Boredom Matters. And the title of her talk today is Boredom and the Unoriginality of Romance Fiction. So thank you very much. Annie, la parole est à vous.
Thank you very much.
You're
You're stuck with having to look at me again, it turns out. Let me just share my screen so you can see my presentation. Yes, so I'm here to talk about romance fiction. Sort of as a start off, I am a romance reader myself, so there's a lot of insights that I can give if anyone is really interested in the topic beyond what I'm talking about today. So romance fiction is a really big business. It's an extremely popular genre of fiction, has billions of dollars of sales annually throughout the world, particularly in the UK and the US. It's very popular in the UK. More than 20% of all the books sold each year are romance novels. When you just look at paperbacks, that's even more. Sometimes over 50% of the books kind of fall into the romance category. As part of this big business, it was really one of the trailblazing genres that established the commercialization of the publishing industry, and that idea of genre fiction, which has a very clear-cut audience and is kind of targeting the audience and supplying the audience on a regular basis. There were established publishing houses that really only publish romance fiction, Harlequin being sort of the most famous one, still one of the biggest publishing houses in the world, and with billions and billions of romance books being published. What kind of sets romance fiction apart is that it's a genre that is largely written by women and for women, which might, in a way, explain how there is still maybe sort of not being talked about that much, that, even though it is such a big business and so much money being made, it's not necessarily something that is being highlighted a lot, or, there are hardly any, reviews of romance fiction in, serious publications. When it comes to the commercialization of romance fiction, the marketing is very much about about finding the right audiences. So it's all about making sure that the moment you see the book, you know exactly what you're going to get. So there are various subgenres of romance fiction that kind of make it very clear what you're getting when you're picking up the book. Obviously, there's varieties within these different genres or subgenres, depending also how much sexiness you want. That kind of depends on, and that is also clearly shown in the way that they are marketed. As you can see, there's a sort of a sliding scale of the way that these books are being presented. I've kind of included at the very bottom LGBTQ plus as a genre or a subgenre. I would probably argue that that's not so much a subgenre, but a lot of the novels that are being published nowadays, even more that's kind of a growing category of the romance novels that, have lesbian and gay and bisexual storylines, or transgender or non-binary storylines. And you would probably find them in all of those categories. So you will get stories that have, two women falling in love in space, that would kind of fall into the sci-fi category, or, two male detectives falling in love, that would be sort of suspense, but, also fall under the category of that kind of subgenre of LGBTQ+. So that's kind of to give you an idea, what are we looking at, and the amount of stuff that is being produced and how it is being targeted. One of the key features of romance novels is also that the publishing is very much focusing on seriality. So there are book series that are being published sometimes where the characters are sort of reoccurring and again, or the story is kind of following one couple throughout a number of different books. But you also get sort of independent individual stories that kind of are packaged as a series, which once again makes it very easy for people to pick up the next book and the next book and the next book, which obviously, increases sales. It's also the case that a lot of romance readers are what I would call high frequency readers. So people will go through a lot of books in very quick succession. And, I've kind of read studies about romance novel readers who kind of, read, I don't know, like almost a book a day type of thing. So it's really very high frequency, and that kind of stands out from other types of literature that is being consumed at a different pace, and obviously also contributes to its commercial success. So what exactly is romance fiction? So sort of on a very basic level, it has two main ingredients. It has to include a central love story, and it has to, what I would call, have narrative closure. So it has to have an emotionally satisfying ending. So those are the two main sort of features, and around that, there's a lot of flexibility what might happen. However, it is generally said that romance fiction is very stereotypical, very repetitive, and potentially very unrealistic. That has to do with a number of features that are kind of suppose derived from the fact that they have these kind of like two main ingredients, and you have to stick with that. Although I would probably argue that over time there is a bit more flexibility in romance fiction nowadays than there maybe used to be in the, say, 1980s or something, also because of LGBTQ plus kind of interests are being kind of introduced into stories. But in general, it's still true that it has a very rigid story structure, very much the kind of traditional 3-act structure that basically follows two people who are falling in love. So you'll have an introduction, some sort of setup where people kind of meeting each other for the first time, then maybe affection develops, one falls in love with the other, or both fall in love with each other at the same time, that kind of thing. I'm being told that you can usually predict exactly when the first sex scene will occur during the reading of a romance novel, as it tends to be at the 60% mark. It's definitely not the case that that's true for every romance novel, but it's definitely a theme that kind of occurs. Usually after that, there will be some sort of conflict, a fallout, I don't know, a misunderstanding, some sort of confusion, or kind of external circumstances that keep the two lovers apart. And then at the very end, obviously, the final positive resolution. There's another aspect that makes romance fiction very repetitive, stereotypical and unrealistic, and that has to do with the story characters that appear. You could call them stock characters. So obviously, you usually have two main main heroes, and a hero and a heroine most of the time if you're looking at straight fiction. Obviously, because there is also more sort of diverse types of romance fiction, I would probably say it's not 100% true anymore, that it's always exactly like this, but it's still something that appears a lot of the time. So the classic heroine being sort of shown as, on the one hand, very independent and fiery and witty and intelligent, but also compassionate and kind, somebody who's sort of unconsciously very beautiful, isn't even aware of the fact that she's really alluring to the hero, and also a sort of level of like inexperience, of childishness, of innocence, a lot of the time still sort of linked to that idea of virginity. So I kind of look at that and think very much of that kind of like hero of, or heroine in this case, of Beauty and the Beast, for example, or maybe if you look at like Pride and Prejudice, that kind of falls into that category. And on the switch side, the hero, once again, a very stereotypical, character that the classic sort of tall, dark and beautiful, handsome type of person, who tends to be ill-tempered and brooding, but usually very rich and successful. So it's kind of that mix of things, usually also contrasted very much to the innocence and inexperience, kind of someone who's very experienced, and sometimes even like depicted as promiscuous. So those are all aspects that kind of every time you pick up a book, you're basically picking up exactly the same book, only with like small variations, because these are sort of the recurring things that you'll come across when you pick up one of those romance novels. So the question is, why do people even bother? Why do they read romance fiction? So the first aspect I'd like to point out is what I would call falling under the category of intellectual enjoyment, I guess. So the one aspect being what I would call genre writing, or genre reading rather. So reading of a particular book within the context or within the system of an established genre. So the more romance you read, the more you become an expert of the genre, and you're able to sort of appreciate the fine variations and kind of compare different stories to each other, and kind of, find enjoyment and appreciation in those like slight nuances and little surprises that are popping up along the way. Also, especially in the age of the internet, there's also a community aspect that comes into this genre reading, as people exchange their views and share their ideas and compare stories and things like that. Online, that's kind of a big thing. So that also obviously adds to the enjoyment and to the sort of intellectual engagement with the story and the book in general. On the other hand, there's a category of intellectual enjoyment that I would sort of call anticipation, maybe. So in general, for romance novels, it's the case that the reader will know more than the characters. That's not just because obviously the reader knows I'm reading in a romance here, so it will end well, but also because within the story, there are a lot of hints being dropped about, one person falling in love with the other, or things that are sort of developing. So as a reader, you kind of, make predictions and conjectures of what might happen and what is really going on when there's like misunderstandings and things like that. So you kind of get that pleasure of like getting sort of intellectually involved in what might be happening and decoding the text. And then obviously the sort of pleasure of being right at the end of it. That kind of, makes romance reading a positive and nice experience, and why people would pick up the book. However, it's clear that these two things are true for any type of fiction reading, basically. So if you think about, say, detective stories, there's definitely both the genre reading and this level of anticipation of like, thinking about what might happen next is definitely also happening in the case of, say, a detective story. So it doesn't really set apart the romance and why romance is so successful, despite it being such a like formulaic genre. So there have been a number of different studies about romance reading across basically this study by Jane Radway from the 1980s is sort of like the big one that was kind of establishing the whole discourse, I guess. And she asked people why they read romance, and these are sort of the responses that she got. Those are the sort of most popular things that people pointed out that have to do with like relaxation, getting away from things, escaping your problems, kind of, finding like positive reinforcement or positive feelings in the stories. So what people get out of the romance novels are sort of very much emotional responses, things like excitement, satisfaction, contentment, self-confidence, even like pride and power were things that are being mentioned in the context of studies where people have looked at romance readers and, you know, why they do what they're doing. So in general, I would probably call this type of engagement with the story effective reading. And romance is very good at establishing sort of a safe space for what I would call effective reading, which you can maybe contrast to, say, critical reading, which would be something where you kind of intellectually analyze a lot of things. In contrast, effective reading is really getting into the story, feeling the way through the story, empathizing, identifying with the characters, and getting really emotionally invested. It's also been shown that many romance readers show a general tendency towards empathy. So their character traits tend to sort of lean towards that side. So it's quite easy for the kind of people who like reading romance to empathize with the characters and really get into the story. And the things that make romance sort of predictable and stereotypical, the simple and predictable storylines that you come across and the sort of stock characters, they establish a safe space in which people can empathize and find emotional outlet through reading. Because obviously, if you're getting into the story, it's clear that the story will end well. So there is a sort of like a safety net that you're not going to like end up at tears at the end, but you're always going to get a positive, reinforcement from the stories. So if we once again look at these responses that Jane Radway got from readers back in the 80s, I think two things that I kind of want to pick up on is that sense of sort of escape and sense of, kind of wanting to secure their own time. There's also a tendency that a lot of readers of romance will sort of talk about almost using romance in a way that other people might use alcohol or drugs or antidepressants. There's definitely an indication that there is increased consumption of romance novels in times of crisis. So when you're down and the world is too much for you, that kind of thing, you'll pick up another book and another book. Radway put it this way: their intense reliance on these books suggests strongly that they help to fulfill deeply felt psychological needs. So the question is, if there are psychological needs that need to be addressed, why is that? Why are romance readers kind of like longing for that? So it might be interesting to just look at the typical romance reader in general. It's quite interesting that actually hasn't changed much. So the statistics that I've got on here from 2017 are not really that different from what, say, Radway found in the 80s or something like that. I would probably say that age range between 35 and 39 is very narrow in this like typical romance reader case. A lot of the studies that I have read had very broad categories, from people like in their early 20s to, people, I don't know, in their 60s or something like that. So, but in general, I think these different, characteristics of the typical romance reader kind of shows that the demographic that is reading romance novels, they tend to be the kind of demographic that is most strongly affected by the oppositional demands of care responsibilities and professional life, if they have a job, as well as sort of patriarchal structures that need to be navigated. In terms of, you could probably argue that white people kind of have a privilege in terms of, opposing demands and patriarchal structures, because obviously you do have a privilege in that position, but maybe there is an aspect of sort of loneliness that might come into white women kind of in that position, in contrast to other ethnicities that have more of a sort of cultural, like a community spirit. Obviously I'm kind of generalizing a lot here, but that might also come into it. But in general, sort of the especially the fact that they're a lot of them being in straight relationships in that age bracket kind of maybe shows a number of different demands that might fall onto these women in that time in their lives. So reading romance really offers a reprieve from everyday demands and limiting relationships. Obviously, back in the 80s, when Redway was talking to women, they were talking a lot about, the demands of raising children and sort of having to emotionally support their partners, look after, elderly family members and all these kind of things that, are very much still, very traditional gender roles that have, an emotional impact in a way. So the romance novels give a sense of control within the predictable story that is maybe contrasted with feelings of powerlessness and predictability, etc., in real life situations, which is also quite interesting to think about that romance novels had sort of a spike in sales also sort of at the during the time of the pandemic, where, there was probably a general sense of like loss of control and powerlessness and predictability. So that's quite interesting, correlation. There is the romance novels give an opportunity to vicariously experience care and nurturing that might be missing from readers' lives, particularly if you're sort of in a straight relationship where, there might be situations where your partner might not be able to support you in the right way because they're raised to be told that men don't necessarily take the roles of care and nurturing, so that might come into it. There's also a sense of liberation from the need to perform, because a lot of the stories describe love in a way that's kind of unconditional and inescapable, which, is also sort of ego stroking and kind of a good feeling to get. And then the lessening of loneliness, not just because you're kind of following a romance story along its way, but also possibly because of the engagement. Oh, yes, I'm almost done. So in conclusion,
perfect.
The fact is that people who read romance don't ever get bored of a romance, and the way that works is that romance kind of, or romance reading, I suppose the act, not the romance itself, but the engagement with the literature kind of prevents being bored because of these like three aspects that I've kind of talked about. So on the one hand, genre reading practices that are kind of allowing a shift of attention to sort of the details and therefore create meaning, and also maybe a community aspect that comes from that. Then the self-rewarding cognitive activities of anticipation, which I think you could argue is a sense of play or an element of play that is being introduced into the reading experience, which can also create meaning. And then finally, the effective reading and identification with the heroes or heroine in the story, which kind of makes every individual story unique and riveting, and about finding a new love, which is basically sort of the opposite of boredom, I would argue. One of the things I would like to highlight is that there is another connection between boredom and romance. So not so much about whether or not boredom is why people don't get bored when they're reading a very like stereotypical story, but what I was looking at in terms of the connection between sort of coping with unsatisfactory situations that you're placed in your life because of social structures and unmet desires, and kind of using romance as a response. So there's kind of an ongoing debate whether that would be a good thing, because it would prevent people, because some people would argue that, boredom is a healthy response because it allows you to kind of adapt your behavior, to make changes in your life, that kind of thing. Whereas romance reading is not so much about changing changing behaviors. It's basically you're then returning to the original sort of status quo. So this is kind of an ongoing debate in the romance literature, in the romance studies that is kind of about that idea of perpetual avoidance on the one hand, and on the other hand, sort of that positive release that might potentially also make a change over longer periods of time. I'm just going to quickly read those two quotes to give you a taste of that, and that's the end of my presentation. Okay. So consumption of one temporarily satisfying romance will lead to the need and desire for another. The vicarious pleasure offered by romance fiction finally may be satisfying enough to forestall the need for more substantial change in the reader's life. At the same time, its very ephemerality may guarantee perpetual desire to repeat the experience. So that would be sort of the one idea of romance not really being a very, good solution to a problem. On the other hand, romance plots and masochistic fantasies, which might be energized by reading romance novels, are fictional, private, and safe spaces where women can explore their own capacity for pleasure, and where women are relatively unconstrained by social consequences. So it can be a starting point of potentially something, something more productive. And that is that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Annie. So now it's time for questions and comments. We have 10 minutes for that. So Marius wrote a question in the chat. Maybe Marius, you can read it yourself. So
yeah, I could. A wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering about two issues. How would you explain the average age of the typical romance reader? Yeah, this is 35, 39 years old. Because this is something for further qualitative research. Yeah, was probably quantitative, so qualitative. And the second thing about these unmet expectations or desires, maybe this could be the starting point as you specified, but maybe ending point as well, because the reality after reading so much romances can be even more boring in comparison. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, potentially. So in regard to the, the typical demographic, I would probably argue, especially if we're looking at people who have kind of adapted a lifestyle that has very traditional gender roles. I suppose you're kind of, in your mid-30s or kind of falling out of the bracket where you have very small children. So you might have more time. You might also have maybe more financial power in order to buy these books. But on the other hand, you're still sort of constricted by that kind of demand of different types of, like care responsibilities and, basically like organizing family life and things like that. So I think that might explain it. But as I said, I'm not entirely sure if, because I suppose it is as a case-by-case basis. So even though sort of the average might fall into that bracket, the sort of the range is a lot broader. So yeah. In terms of what you said about the unmet desires being sort of a starting point, an end point, right? That's what you said.
Yeah, you said the starting point, and this is one thing, but maybe also an ending point.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And I think that's kind of what the point that was being made with that idea of like a perpetual sort of avoidance. So while you're reading the story, you're sort of completely submerged or immersed into the story, and all of these sort of unmet desires are all of a sudden met because even vicariously you're sort of feeling with the characters. You're that kind of idea of effective reading where it really matters what's happening to the characters, and you're kind of very much emotionally involved. So for that period of time, there are no unmet desires because this is the love of your life or whatever, but obviously the moment you close the book, story is finished, you still find yourself in the same situation again. So but for that short period of time, And I think there's also like that sense of like a little bit of an like afterglow effect, that people are sort of then be able to dive back into real life and tackle things because they had that sort of reprieve and sort of like positive engagement and you know, all the positive feelings that come with reading the stories. But obviously it's still kind of you know, you give it another day or two and you're kind of at the same situation again, where, you know, you basically have to pick up the next book, which is, you know, why romance novels are so successful, because it is sort of like just a cycle. Don't know if that answers the question, Marius.
Yes, definitely. I will look forward to reading about this more.
Okay, we have another question in our chat. Emmanuel, would you like to read it yourself?
Yeah, I wanted to find out how does the proficiency of the writer of romantic novels actually affect the reader? Is there a relationship between how proficient you are as a writer and how people will not be bored when they read your romantic novel, or just because the material is romantic, people will still not be bored? I don't know if it makes sense.
I think it does. So that's quite an interesting question, because obviously romance has that very like broad range of you know, literary quality, you could say. So, you know, some things like Jane Austen obviously being very high quality, still a classic, you know, classic romance stories, or, you know, Bronte stories or something like that are, you know, like really considered canonical sort of works of literary fiction on the one hand, and then obviously this kind of like very trashy, low quality things. And I'm not entirely sure, like from my personal experience of reading, I would definitely say that there is an impact in the enjoyment if it is not well written. However, I'm not entirely sure if it really affects the levels of boredom, because it's definitely the case that most readers of romantic fiction don't read it for the literary you know, aspects of it. So they're probably more forgiving about you know, bad language or awkward storytelling or something like that, because they just want to sort of, you know, get to the point, get to, you know, the romance, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to think about, but I would probably assume that it's not something that really affects the you know, the experience of being immersed into the stories that romances are so, you know, supportive of.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. Sorry. I wanted to also find out how does cultural context, what is the role does that cultural context play? Because I have read some romantic books that really people are making a fuss of it, but I really didn't get it because the choice of words and the setting was different. Did your work look at that too as well?
No, I have to say, I haven't really looked at, you know, like cultural settings at this point. I'm not sure if I can say anything significant about it. I mean, there's definitely sort of a cultural sort of baseline that is being established with a lot of romance. So it almost, you know, kind of expects you to, like, you know, be able to pick up on certain tropes or be familiar with certain you know, stock characters, something like that, that might kind of benefit your understanding of the stories. You know, like these kind of like fairy tale ideas that might come into romance fiction, but because a lot of the fiction is also, you know, popular fiction, I don't think it's necessary for you to know all of these tropes or all of these you know, specific references that are being made in order to get the storyline. So it might just be that one is maybe not inclined to really get into the story and sort of, you know, be pulled away by the emotions or something. If there's you know, like little things that are sort of like really annoying where language is really bad. Or I definitely have that I pick up a book and I start reading it and there's just something that really annoys me about a certain character or whatever. And because it is such a disposable type of you know, fiction, you just, you know, you abandon the book, you pick up the next one. So I think that's kind of like a way of doing it. Like nobody forces themselves through a romance like you would maybe do with like some literary fiction where you go, well, I have to finish reading this now because, you know, it has some sort of value. You don't read it to, you know, I don't know, broaden your horizons or something. You're reading it for the emotional thing that you're getting out of it. So yeah, so I would probably say that it's kind of a very, I would say, yeah, common thing for people to just abandon stories and, you know, go with something else if it doesn't work for them.
Okay, we may have time for one more very short question. Okay. Well, otherwise, we may move to the second speaker. Thank you very much, Annie.
Thank you.
Well, I have myself a lot of comments because I mean I was very amazed by the statistics you offered about the stereotypic reader of romance, kind of white women. I mean, it is as if the romance has inherited or is the version of what was the novel at the end of 18th century and 19th century, because it has the very same kind of reader and a lot of dynamics very, very similar. But well, this would be a path for another conversation. In any case, thank you very much.